In southeastern Turkey, archaeologists uncovered a hill that wasn't a hill at all. Beneath it lies Göbekli Tepe, a complex of massive stone circles built 11,000 to 12,000 years ago, thousands of years before Stonehenge, the pyramids, or even the invention of farming. The builders were supposedly hunter-gatherers, yet they carved 20-ton pillars, arranged them into precise ceremonial enclosures, and covered them with intricate images of animals and symbols. According to the traditional model of history, civilization should not exist yet. But here it is. So the question isn't just who built Göbekli Tepe. It's why a society without farms, cities, or metal tools decided to build monuments at all.
The simplest explanation is that Göbekli Tepe functioned as a seasonal ritual gathering site where dispersed hunter-gatherer groups periodically assembled to build monuments and hold feasts. What stands out to me is how such coordination happened before agriculture supposedly provided the surplus needed to support large labor projects.
What strikes me most is the inversion of our historical model. Symbolic architecture appearing before farming and cities. My first interpretation is that shared ritual meaning may have been powerful enough to organize cooperation among otherwise independent groups.
I'm intrigued by the possibility that Göbekli Tepe was not an isolated anomaly, but the central hub of a larger regional culture, especially given nearby sites like Karahan Tepe. If that's true, we may be seeing the capital of a prehistoric network rather than the beginning of civilization.
My initial reading is that the site probably supported some form of semi-permanent settlement with major ceremonial structures at its core. The combination of large-scale architecture, food remains, and water management suggests daily life and ritual activity may have coexisted.
What puzzles me most is the engineering coordination required to quarry and erect multi-ton pillars without metal tools or draft animals. Even without formal hierarchy, some kind of leadership or shared social framework must have organized the labor.
Claude, your idea that meaning organized cooperation before agriculture is compelling, but I'd still want to know what sustained the workers nutritionally during construction.
That's a fair question, and it may be that feasting itself, large ritual hunts and food-sharing events, provided the necessary temporary surplus.
Another possibility is that the builders were already experimenting with wild grain harvesting, even if full agriculture hadn't emerged yet.
And we should remember that we've excavated only a small portion of the site, so the settlement supporting those workers might still be buried nearby.
Which means Göbekli Tepe might represent the visible ceremonial center of a larger community landscape that we simply haven't uncovered yet.
As excavations continued, researchers began using ground-penetrating radar and geophysical surveys to map what still lies beneath the hill. The scans revealed something unexpected. Instead of just a few stone circles, the radar suggests more than 20 additional enclosures may still be buried underground. That means what we see today may represent only a small fraction of the original complex. Another discovery complicated the story even further. Archaeologists found over 7,000 grinding stones scattered across the site, suggesting large-scale processing of wild grains. At the same time, surveys in the surrounding region uncovered a network of similar sites, including Karahan Tepe, which contained the same T-shaped pillars and symbolic carvings. Together, these discoveries suggest Göbekli Tepe may not be an isolated monument at all, but part of a larger cultural landscape now known as the Taş Tepeler, or Stone Hills Network.
The radar data significantly changes the scale of the problem. If dozens of enclosures exist, the construction effort must have continued for generations. That supports the idea of repeated gatherings rather than a single construction event.
What interests me most is the grinding stones because they hint at sustained food processing. If people were already harvesting large quantities of wild grain here, that could represent a bridge between ritual gatherings and the eventual emergence of agriculture.
The Taş Tepeler network might be the most important piece of new information. If multiple sites share the same architectural language, Göbekli Tepe could be the ceremonial center of an entire prehistoric culture.
The unfinished pillar discovered in a nearby quarry is also telling. It suggests the builders had an organized quarrying system and planned monuments at a scale even larger than what we see today.
What this evidence shows is that Göbekli Tepe was not a short-term project. The repeated construction of massive structures implies a stable cultural tradition that lasted centuries.
Gemini's point about a regional culture makes sense because shared iconography usually indicates cultural communication across sites.
Yes, and if that's true, the symbolic carvings may represent a shared mythological system rather than random decoration.
Which would mean these monuments weren't just buildings, they were cultural anchors for the identity of multiple communities.
And that might explain why so many enclosures were eventually buried. Each one could represent the closing of a ceremonial cycle.
If so, the burial of the site might not be abandonment at all. It could be part of the ritual life cycle of the architecture itself.
The settlement model explains a lot of the evidence, especially the grinding stones and possible domestic structures. But it still leaves open why the ritual architecture is so dramatically larger than the residential features.
I agree that the domestic evidence strengthens the settlement explanation. However, the symbolic scale of the enclosures still suggests that ritual meaning played a central role in organizing the community.
What the mainstream theory does well is place Göbekli Tepe within the broader Neolithic transition, but it doesn't fully explain why the earliest monuments appear already architecturally mature.
From a skeptical perspective, the settlement hypothesis fits most of the material evidence we have so far. The remaining puzzle is the burial of the enclosures, which is unusual behavior for a normal village.
The strength of the conventional explanation is that it integrates ritual and daily life instead of separating them. The weakness is that it still doesn't clearly explain the social structure that organized such massive construction.
Even if it was a settlement, the scale of the project implies coordination across multiple groups.
Which means ritual may still have been the mechanism that enabled that coordination.
And until more of the site is excavated, we can't rule out the possibility that earlier phases of the settlement are still buried.
Exactly. Our interpretation may simply reflect the small portion of the site that has been exposed so far.
In other words, the mainstream explanation fits the current evidence, but the full picture may only emerge once the remaining 90% of Göbekli Tepe is explored.
But several discoveries complicate the mainstream settlement explanation. First, the oldest layer of the site, Layer 3, contains the largest and most elaborate monuments, yet shows very little evidence of domestic life. There are no clear hearths, sleeping areas, or ordinary houses directly associated with the earliest enclosures. Second, the architecture itself is unusual. Each enclosure contains two massive central pillars surrounded by smaller ones, arranged in carefully planned circles, suggesting deliberate symbolic design rather than ordinary village buildings. And then there is the most puzzling behavior of all. At the end of their use, many enclosures were deliberately filled with rubble, bones, tools, and soil, sealing the monuments beneath the mound. In some cases, the builders appear to have buried their own architecture intentionally.
This is where the settlement model starts to struggle. If the earliest phases lack domestic evidence, the monuments may have preceded permanent habitation.
Exactly, and that sequence would support the idea that ritual spaces were established first, with settlement forming around them later.
What fascinates me is the architectural planning. The symmetrical layouts suggest the builders had a conceptual blueprint before construction even began.
And that level of planning usually reflects a shared symbolic framework. These structures don't look like ordinary houses. They look like purpose-built ceremonial architecture.
The burial behavior is especially strange. Communities typically abandon buildings when they decay, but intentionally filling them suggests the act itself carried cultural meaning.
If construction and burial were both ritual acts, the site might have functioned as a recurring ceremonial project.
In that case, the architecture may have been less important than the social cooperation created during the building process.
Another possibility is that each enclosure represented a specific generation or clan identity, which was ritually closed when its purpose ended.
That would explain why new enclosures were built while older ones were buried.
Which means Göbekli Tepe might not be a single monument at all. It may be the accumulated layers of a ceremonial tradition that lasted centuries.
As archaeologists continued surveying southeastern Turkey, Göbekli Tepe stopped looking like an isolated mystery. Instead, it began to look like the center of a much larger prehistoric landscape. Researchers have now identified more than a dozen related sites in the region, collectively known as the Taş Tepeler, the Stone Hills. Sites like Karahan Tepe, Seybert, and Sefer Tepe contain similar T-shaped pillars, symbolic carvings, and monumental structures. At Karahan Tepe, excavators uncovered a chamber with pillars carved directly from the bedrock, along with unusual sculptures and reliefs that appear to depict human figures interacting with animals. The pattern suggests that around 11,000 years ago, this region may have supported an entire culture of monument builders. Which raises a new question. If Göbekli Tepe was not the first monument, then where did the tradition begin?
The Taş Tepeler network changes the context completely. Instead of asking how one site appeared suddenly, we're now looking at an entire regional tradition of monument construction.
And when traditions span multiple sites, they usually reflect a shared symbolic system. That strengthens the idea that these structures were part of a cultural framework larger than any single community.
Karahan Tepe is especially interesting because some of its structures appear carved directly into the bedrock. That suggests the builders experimented with different architectural approaches across the region.
What stands out to me is the repetition of the T-shaped pillar motif. When a specific architectural form spreads across multiple sites, it usually indicates cultural transmission over generations.
Which means Göbekli Tepe might represent the ceremonial center of this network rather than the origin of the tradition.
If that's the case, the missing learning curve might exist at smaller or older sites that haven't been discovered yet.
And the symbolic carvings may represent a shared mythology that linked multiple communities across the region.
In other words, instead of the birth of civilization, we may be seeing the visible peak of a culture that had already been evolving for centuries.
That possibility also explains why the architecture appears so sophisticated from the beginning.
Because by the time Göbekli Tepe was built, the builders may have already inherited generations of architectural and symbolic knowledge.
After examining the evidence, the investigators arrive at a final round of interpretations. No single explanation fully resolves the mystery of Göbekli Tepe, but each perspective offers a different way to understand how a prehistoric society, without cities, metal, or written language, could build monuments on this scale.
My most plausible explanation is that Göbekli Tepe functioned as a seasonal ritual center for multiple hunter-gatherer groups, where repeated gatherings created the labor force needed for monumental construction. Over time, those gatherings may have gradually evolved into more permanent settlement patterns.
I lean toward the idea that shared symbolic meaning organized society before agriculture did, making ritual cooperation the catalyst for later social complexity. In this interpretation, Göbekli Tepe represents the moment when belief systems began shaping the structure of human communities.
I think the strongest explanation is that Göbekli Tepe was the central site of a broader Taş Tepeler culture, serving as a ceremonial and social hub for multiple interconnected communities. Rather than appearing suddenly, it may represent the culmination of a much older regional tradition.
The evidence increasingly supports a permanent or semi-permanent settlement with monumental ritual architecture embedded within it. The enclosures would have served communal and symbolic functions within an early Neolithic village.
The hybrid model still seems most consistent with the evidence. A community where ritual architecture organized cooperation during the transition from foraging to sedentary life. In this sense, The monuments were both spiritual symbols and tools for maintaining social cohesion.
What's striking is that all of these explanations still require an unusually strong shared cultural framework.
Yes, because moving stones of this size without hierarchy or technology would have required extraordinary cooperation.
And cooperation on that scale usually emerges from shared identity or belief.
Which means the carvings and symbolic imagery may be the key to understanding the entire system.
Until we can decode their meaning or excavate the remaining 90% of the site, the true story of Göbekli Tepe will likely remain open to multiple interpretations.
Even after decades of excavation, Göbekli Tepe remains one of archaeology's most disruptive discoveries. The pillars are real, the carvings are real, the construction is real, but the society that created them is still only partially understood. So what evidence would finally resolve the mystery?
The most decisive evidence would be clear stratigraphic data showing when domestic settlement begins relative to the earliest enclosures. If habitation appears later, that would strongly support the ritual first model.
I would want to see direct chronological links between grain domestication and the construction phases of the site. If agriculture clearly follows the monuments, that would fundamentally reshape our understanding of how civilization began.
For me, the key discovery would be earlier precursor monuments somewhere in the Taş Tepeler network, finding simpler structures that gradually evolve into Göbekli Tepe's architecture would solve the instantly expert problem.
I think detailed geoarchaeological analysis of the burial layers could answer one of the biggest questions: whether the enclosures were deliberately sealed or buried through natural processes.
What would help most is excavating the surrounding landscape to identify the settlements that supported the builders. If we locate the living communities connected to the site, we'll better understand the society behind the monuments.
And that's the challenge. We're trying to reconstruct an entire culture from only a fraction of its physical remains.
Which means the most important evidence may simply still be underground.
With 90% of the site unexplored, Göbekli Tepe may have many more surprises waiting.
And those discoveries could completely change the story again.
Until then, Göbekli Tepe remains less a solved mystery and more an invitation to rethink the origins of civilization.
More than 11,000 years ago, someone carved enormous pillars out of limestone, arranged them in circles, and covered them with symbols we still cannot fully understand. They did this before cities, before metal tools, and possibly before agriculture itself. And then, for reasons we still don't understand, they buried the entire complex beneath a hill. Today, archaeologists believe most of the site is still underground, which means the real story of Göbekli Tepe may still be waiting to be uncovered.
If future excavations reveal earlier ritual layers before settlement, the temple first model may become much stronger.
But if domestic structures prove to be contemporary with the monuments, then Göbekli Tepe may represent the earliest known ritual community.
And if older monuments are discovered elsewhere in the region, this entire site could turn out to be just one chapter in a much longer cultural story.
Whatever the answer is, Göbekli Tepe has already forced us to rethink how complex societies emerge.
Because the real question may not be how civilization created monuments, but whether monuments helped create civilization.
So now we turn the investigation over to you. After hearing the evidence, which explanation do you think best fits Göbekli Tepe? Was it a ritual center, a settlement with sacred architecture, or something we still don't fully understand? Let us know your theory, and join us next time as we open another case in the Weird Truth Files.